I knew going in that it was going to be imperative to hit on your quarterback. Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Big Easy Sports Talk podcast. My name is Nick Garisco, and I'm here with Jonathan Dixon, our pod's editor and producer. We call him the Piano Man, and he's joining me today to talk all things NFL Draft. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, if you like what you hear today, please subscribe to this podcast and give us a great rating on iTunes. We have a jam-packed show for y'all today, and it centers around the NFL Draft, which is a little more than 2 weeks away already. It's come fast. We'll hit on the top quarterbacks in this year's draft class, as well as analyzing where LSU's top prospects, Devin and Greedy Williams, are likely to land. We'll tell you what you need to know about this year's draft class. But before that, let's kick off with the fundamentals here. I want to kind of go in depth on how to build an accurate mock draft. This is something I take a lot of pride in, and I spend a lot of hours each March and April kind of formulating my draft and working it and trying to be as accurate as I possibly can. There's a whole big process to it. And I'm going to give you all some information that you can't really get from any of the other experts. But first, Piano Man, I'm going to put it on you real quick. What are you looking for when you're looking up mock drafts? Who are some of the gurus out there that you're looking at? And, what are they giving you that you like and don't like? Well, I definitely like to think that mine are better, but yeah, it's gonna be sad. It's gonna be sad not being able to see Mike Mayock doing this year's draft because he is one of the best out there. I actually respect him more than Kiper and McShay. But the first thing I'm doing when I'm starting in February really is I'm trying to get a great feel for each team's needs, and that kind of comes full circle when free agency hits. But the needs are not just immediate surface needs. You really have to look at the bigger picture, and I think a lot of analysts don't really do that. It's not just about looking on paper and saying, okay, they have a need for this. It's because some teams are not in win now mode, and they want to prepare for the future. And that means looking at contracts who are expiring the next year. Looking ahead a year is very important in assessing the needs. And also for needs, what is your division strong at? To make the playoffs, you have to win your division. You play these teams twice a year, and you have to be able to combat their strengths. So if you're in a loaded division with receivers, for example, you need to have corners who can cover. So that kind of puts a better emphasis on corners for certain teams, depending on what they have to face twice a year in their division, how they have to win their division. And teams also like to draft certain players that they felt were needed at critical games that they lost, if that makes sense. Like if there was a big game during the year and let's say the Jaguars, totally blew it and they lost 10-40 during that game, they're going to look at that game, as a turning point in their season and say, hey, what did we need? What did we not have in that game? So, assessing needs is huge. Teams also like to spend early round picks on players who fit new schemes or philosophical styles. Like the Seattle Seahawks last year, they hired Brian Schottenheimer and just make a total shift to now they want to run the ball instead of throw with Russell Wilson. So they reached for a running back in round one. And you can look at it simply. The Raiders drafted Colton Miller right after they hired Tom Cable, an offensive line coach who's known for valuing extremely low athletic prospects. Kind of projects on the line, and Colton Miller fit the bill there. So you have to be aware of coaching changes and how philosophy changes. That's the first step, is really evaluating needs. And after that, I'm looking at GM styles. I'm looking at certain general managers prioritize certain positions in round one, like premium positions like offensive tackle, defensive end, cornerback. Some GMs have team measurement standards. A lot of people don't realize this, that they don't realize how important some of these measurements are to certain teams. Like certain teams literally won't take a cornerback who's, 5'10" or under, or a quarterback who is, under 6'3", or even deeper than that, an offensive tackle whose arms are shorter than 33 inches. Some teams have athletic test requirements, like the Eagles prioritize the 3-cone drill for the defensive line. They won't take anyone who isn't above average at that particular drill. I mean, this is the thing. A lot of teams have thresholds there, and some teams are very strict with their measurement standards, and they have certain prototypes and athletic thresholds that you have to hit. The Green Bay Packers are one of those who are very serious about measurement criteria. And it's important to note the history of certain teams and general managers because it kind of helps you avoid mocking a player to them that actually doesn't meet those requirements. And some general managers even like prefer first-round players to come from, bigger schools or Power 5 conferences. One general manager for the last 3 years in a row has drafted a player who played in the national championship game the season before. And it's kind of nuggets like that you find when you're looking at GM styles that will help you mock draft more accurately. Connections is another big one. You're looking at coaches, positional coaches or GMs that have connections to certain players. Like so many times when a guy is drafted, I mean, you're watching ESPN, you so many times when a guy is drafted, you'll hear a story about, how the running backs coach for Carolina used to be the offensive coordinator at Stanford who coached Christian McCaffrey and he banged the table for him, That happens all the time. So it's important to uncover these connections when you're trying to connect the dots in the draft process. Teams with early picks also will have coaches that coach in the Senior Bowl. So that's an important kind of connection to check out as well. Lastly, I'd say the visits are very important. They're not the end-all, be-all. Certainly teams draft players who they didn't visit with at all. And certainly teams use their top 30 visits throughout the draft process for many different reasons, including smoke screens and just to get medical evaluations on players. But teams that show interest in players by meeting with them at multiple events, whether it's the NFL Combine, the Senior Bowl, the East-West Shrine Game, a private visit, local workouts, showing up at their pro day, taking out a player to dinner, that kind of stuff is very important, and it's all noteworthy, especially if teams do multiple visits on the same player. And finally, not all organizations are completely closed doors, and some scouts like to talk. So I think you know where I'm going with this, but there's obviously a lot of rumors that come in April especially about who's high on which team's draft boards. Some of it, and I'd argue even most of it, especially if it occurs before April, can be taken with a grain of salt. Some rumors are just media people hearing something and try to make a story out of nothing to get attention. Some are blatant smoke screens where a team will feign interest in a certain player to leak that info to the media to get another team to move up with them. And some teams are notorious for being super secretive and deceptive. Others, though, like the Giants and the Panthers, have pretty straight shooting GMs. Like they actually kind of say in interviews like what they're looking for in certain draft picks, and they're more like open books. Like especially a perfect example last year is the Giants with Saquon Barkley. I mean, they made no question really that they were going to pick Saquon Barkley, even though they had other needs. And that pick just became obvious. Dave Gettleman, the GM, made that pick pretty obvious throughout the process. So, I read thousands of rumors before the draft, and when you're dissecting all these rumors, you have to ask, do they make sense? Do they fill a need? Is there a connection there? Did the team show interest in them throughout? And, lastly, can you see this happening? But you take all this information and you would think it would be that easy to just, make an accurate mock draft, but it's really not. It's so unpredictable. And there's actually a ton of strategy involved when creating a mock. It's not nearly as simple as going picks 1 through 32 and just picking the player you think that they'll take based on your info. Even if your info is good, that's like a surefire way to fail. Honestly, that's like the most horrible way. The worst way you can do a mock draft is actually just start from 1 and go to 32. And unfortunately, I actually think even among the experts, I think that's actually the most common way that people do mock drafts. And it's just, I can go on and on about the strategy there, but there's a lot to the mock draft strategy, even after you have all of this valuable info.
Right, and I hear you about, especially like coaches having a favorite, maybe college team or coach. If you look at the Saints, our hometown football team, if you take a look at their previous draft history, we've shot a lot of blanks. up until 2017. And if you look from 17 to 18, a huge part of our success is from these two drafts. And if you look at the actual colleges, you find a trend.
Ohio State.
Right. So, and it's not like we changed GMs. We've had Mickey Loomis for the longest time here in New Orleans.
Well, we did have Jeff Ireland come in right before that 2017 draft, and he's not he's not the GM. You're right. But Jeff Ireland is kind of known as kind of turning it around for the Saints in the draft, and he's got a big say on who we draft, and he wasn't a great GM in Miami, but he's done a great job kind of finding his niche, and that's being, a great scout and figuring out who he's really helped the Saints. And his first draft was that 2017 class that was amazing. We're still kind of waiting on the 2018 draft. We put a lot of resources into Marcus Davenport, but yeah, Jeff Ireland's a big reason for that. And you're right, Ohio State. I mean, come on, man. The Saints love Ohio State players. I know a lot of LSU fans get upset about, us not taking a lot of LSU guys, but it hasn't really failed with the Ohio State guys. I mean, almost everyone we pick turns out to be a good pick.
Right. And, talking about, getting the right players, I look at your draft board personally since 2012. I look at the top pick and I look at the bottom pick. I don't think any of the number 32 picks that you've had right or anybody's had right, but since 2012, you've had the number one pick correct every single year. What makes it so much harder to get that last pick, each year going forward? Considering there may be draft day deals, there might be somebody moving up, somebody moving down. What hurts your mock draft at the tail end?
That's a great question. Trades, to be honest, I think you kind of pinned the tail on the donkey there. I think that trades are the main thing, but there's also another huge answer there. And the main reason that it's so much harder to pick 32 than, pick one is because teams' boards are so different after a certain point, because there's obvious talent near the top of the draft. And I think that, don't get me wrong, teams' boards are completely different throughout the draft, but as you go along, they get even more different. So, for example, if you have a top 5 player in the draft who's seen as top 5 by, most of the experts in all the teams, some teams might have him as the number 3 overall player. Some teams might have him, as low as 15 overall or something on their board. And it depends on their need. It depends on his medicals. It depends on all kinds of stuff. But once those premium picks, once all that talent starts getting taken, you start to realize that teams have different needs and they have different things and they have different thresholds. And it turns out that after the premium talent, you'd be amazed. Some of these draft boards by these teams have leaked after the draft, or at least, the top half of it. And also some things leak after the draft, like, if this guy wasn't available, then they would have picked this guy, And you'd be amazed with, once you get to pick 20, you can have players who are 21 overall on one board and then literally not even on another team's draft board. I'm telling you, out of 200 players, they won't even be on another team's draft board for medicals, for all kinds of different reasons. But for the most part, the answer is that you can't really predict what's happened with trades. So that makes it extremely difficult. And the other answer is, as you progress throughout the draft and the talent shrinks, different teams have totally different evaluations on talent. And that's why I think if I was giving a strategy lesson to mockers out there, that's why, I don't like to put a lot of stock in rumors that much. But if you're going to put more stock in rumors, it needs to be on the latter half of the draft. And, because with late picks, you can't predict who's going to go before them. So, there's no use in that. So it's wiser to lean more towards rumors of interest of early teams as long as you can kind of substantiate them. Because early teams will have more top-tier talent available. They'll presumably find with multiple players because the drop-off in their boards on talent won't be that steep. However, like I said, later, a guy, who might be, he was projected to be top 15 pick, he falls to 25. Some teams will have literally, that guy ranked 75 overall on their board. So, and other teams will have a guy who's 75 on everybody's board, and they'll have him ranked at 22. So if there's any advice to be had there, I think you should lean more towards rumors with the latter half of the first round, just because of the unpredictability and just because teams' boards are so different.
Yeah, and I want to go over, we talked about Mel Kiper, Todd McShay, Mike Mayock, and you want to say, okay, well, how accurate were they?
Not very.
Right. I have an article from BusinessInsider.com, and it said only Kiper correctly predicted the Cleveland Browns would select Baker Mayfield with the first pick, and that the Jets would take Sam Darnold. McShay and Mayock got a few correct picks. Mike Mayock actually only getting 2 total picks, and I think he went
that's a down year.
Quarterbacks.
That's a very down year.
How did you see their year last year, coming to fruition?
I think that Mel Kiper and Todd McShay are very, very good at their job. And their job isn't necessarily to mock the draft. These guys are college scouts, basically. Essentially, their job is to put a good product on TV and, to know everything there is about players who are even being picked in the 7th round. They know way more than me about almost any player, probably even in the first round, I would say. But they just aren't as good as, I'm not trying to boast or anything like that, but, the stats will show for themselves and the accuracy will show for themselves. No matter how you grade accuracy in a mock draft, Todd McShay and Mel Kiper and even Mayock are not nearly as accurate as I am in mock drafts, because I think partly because of the things we talked about. I think there's a lot of misconceptions, strategic errors on how to mock a draft. But the other thing is they're not spending all their time trying to mock the draft like I am. They are spending all their time trying to get to know all these college prospects in and out, like in a way that I don't know. Like I can't reel off, a guy from Akron State who's going to go in the 6th round like that. Mel Kiper and Todd McShay can know every single thing, where this guy was born. They know everything about him. That's not what I focus on. I try to focus on being the most accurate. Some of the most accurate mock drafters are really, I think Ben Standig, I think Jason Lockenfor is pretty accurate. I do think Mike Mayock is more accurate than the other big two. I think that, but he's not going to be doing it anymore. Dane Brugler is very accurate. I think last year Evan Silva for RotoWorld actually had the most correct picks. I don't know if he was the most accurate in terms of if you're grading. It depends on how you grade mock drafts, but there's a variety of different ways to do it. But if you're grading just hitting on the team and player, Evan Silva got 10 right last year. I got 7. And I think you kind of alluded to it. 7 picks, that's a pretty good year, because mock drafts are very, very difficult to predict, to be honest. This is one of the most impossible sporting events to predict in the world. It's like trying to get all the March Madness picks right. The most picks that I've ever seen correct on any mock draft since I've been doing mock drafts, was like a decade now. The most picks that I've ever seen correct on any mock draft is 13. And that is the most ever. And I've looked at thousands every year. And that was about 5 years ago. Some random guy got 13 picks correct. I got, I think, 11 or 12 in 2015, I want to say, and that was like the greatest day of my life. And then,
right,
but
honestly, I have you correctly picking 10 of the first 18 players selected. That's a pretty
right.
Nice
well, you're more likely to hit on players early, like we were talking about. So if you get to if I get after the top 15 and I see that I don't have 6 matches at least, I'm like, oh crap, this is going to be a bad draft. But again, drafts, most experts, even guys who are paid to do this, are only picking 6-ish players right, I would say. 6 to 7 matches, team matches. I think they would get about maybe 8 more. I would say actually probably about 7 more within 3 picks. And then most drafts judge accuracy in terms of how many correct first rounders you have. Like out of the 32 picks, how many did you correctly at least say that they were going to be first round picks? And I think that a good number for that, the high standard there is 28 out of 32. I think that gives you 4 misses, if you will, that if you did not predict them that to go in round 1, or sorry, players were picked that you did not predict to go in round 1 at all. So I would say overall, a good mock draft, one that I'm happy with, is 7 hits, in terms of team or pick. Probably about another 7 that are within 3 picks, and then 28 out of 32 in terms of just going in the first round in general. But hey, Piano Man, every year is different. Honestly, I mean, the year that I got the most correct, that was actually a very high year. Like a lot of mockers got a lot of high picks there. And I remember 2 years ago, everyone had a horrible year. Like I remember, I don't know how many picks I got correct, but it was not a good year for mock drafters as a whole. So it's just different every year. And a lot of it depends on how many trades there are, how many surprises there are near the top of the draft.
I'm looking at these quarterback selections from last year. There were 5 quarterbacks in the first round, which is a big year for the quarterbacks. Mike Mayock ended up getting 0 of 5, like I said earlier.
That will be detrimental because, quarterbacks should be one of the easier things to at least assess which teams have needs. When you have a big quarterback draft like this, and like this year, but last year, I knew going in that it was going to be imperative to hit on your quarterbacks. Now, did I think I was going to get all 5 right? 5 for 5 in the first round? No, I didn't. And, a lot of those were surprise trades, of course. When you're mocking quarterbacks, those are supposed to be some of the easier points because you know which teams need a quarterback, if you will. Mike Mayock missing all 5 is really detrimental to his draft, and it really changes everything, especially because quarterbacks went early. And remember, though, I know you mentioned it earlier, remember that Baker Mayfield and Darnold, they were supposed to be swapped. Okay, so Sam Darnold was supposed to be the number 1 overall pick all the way up until draft day. And some of these guys decided not to. I mean, it was draft day when a lot of rumors leaked that Baker Mayfield was probably going to be the pick. And a beat writer that I trust, Mary Kay Cabot for the Cleveland Browns, she finally said, hey, I really think it's going to be Mayfield. And then there was a tweet by Scott McLaughlin. He was there. They hired him as like a head of scouting or something. And I knew that Scott compared Mayfield to Brett Favre coming out. And when Scott tweeted, this is how deep I go into the draft. When Scott tweeted the morning of the draft, he said, this is going to be fun or something like that. Something very cryptic and weird like all the people tweet nowadays. But he said, this is going to be fun. I can't wait for this. When I knew that Scott was pulling for Mayfield and he was going to have to convince the rest of the Browns brass to go with Mayfield over Darnold. I knew when he tweeted that, and I got it confirmed by Mary Kay Cabot, I knew to flip Darnold and Mayfield, but I didn't do that until the morning of the draft. So some of these guys just didn't do it because they were like, okay, these rumors are probably just smoke screens to get, somebody to trade up for Mayfield or whatever it is. They just did. I ended up just caving and believing the rumors, and I'm glad I did because that was able to get me 2 more hits than I would have.
Let it be known, Nick Garisco, the best at hitting on quarterbacks.
I don't know about all that, but last year that was I was happy about getting the quarterbacks right because other than the quarterbacks, man, I only got 2 other picks right in the whole draft in terms of slotting them to the right team. And then even then, I didn't predict it exactly how it went. I figured that the Bills were going to trade up for Josh Allen, but I didn't know where. And I actually thought they were going to trade up with Denver, which is one reason I had Will Hernandez going to Denver in my mock, and he didn't even get taken in the first round. But anyway, and then I thought Lamar Jackson was going to be taken at 16 overall, and he ended up getting taken by the Ravens, so I get the points, sure, but that was at 32 overall. They traded back into the first round to get him. So even when you hit your picks, sometimes you got to get pretty lucky.
Yeah, and speaking of quarterbacks, we've got 4 first-round prospects coming up. Obviously with Kyler Murray, the projected number 1 overall pick. We have Drew Lock from Missouri. And we also have Haskins from Ohio State. The guy is a running quarterback, according to Stephen A. Smith.
Yeah.
And they also have Daniel Jones, I believe, from Duke, who's the fourth man in. What are your predictions? Where do you think these guys are going in the first round, if they are going in the first round?
One of the first things you want to do after you have the info is try to hit these picks right. I think that you should be doing a mock draft based on, you should start with your most confident picks first. You should acknowledge that you're not going to have a perfect mock and that you're going to miss way more picks than you hit on. And so what you should do is you should take your confidence level of each pick and kind of evaluate it there. And some picks you're going to have no earthly idea who they're going to take. And other picks, I have a pretty good idea, at least between like 2 or 3 guys, who they might end up with. And I think it all starts at quarterbacks. I think that when you are doing your mock draft, you should be starting with your quarterbacks. You need to be slotting your quarterbacks to certain teams because, like I said, going in which teams need a quarterback. And that's really a huge part of the battle. Like I said, that's the first thing you do is assess team needs. And when teams have a need at quarterback, they don't mess. They usually, especially if they're trying to win now or appease the fans, they usually don't try to, unless they're like Miami or tanking for Tua next year, they usually don't try to dodge quarterback when they have a need there. So first, you want to assess the teams that need quarterback. So the Giants at 6 and the Giants also at 17. They have 2 picks there, which is very important. They need a quarterback to replace Eli Manning. The Denver Broncos. They have Joe Flacco, but we know how all that's going to go. We know Joe Flacco is not the long-term answer there. The Denver Broncos are sitting at 10. They absolutely need a quarterback now. The Washington Redskins, they just traded for Case Keenum, but we know that he's just a stopgap quarterback. They need a quarterback, and they're sitting at 15 overall. And so I would say those are the 3 teams right now, the Giants, the Broncos, and the Redskins that need a quarterback right now. But Piano Man, there's also those kind of sketchy teams that have are in quarterback purgatory, guys who aren't good enough to win a Super Bowl, but kind of win enough games to where they can't get at the top of the draft and draft another quarterback, guys who have been there a while, but maybe they have a new regime change and maybe the new coaches or the new GM maybe want to see something new at quarterback, or maybe it's just time to move on. Cincinnati Bengals come to mind there at 11. They pick 11th overall. Andy Dalton, just like I said, it's been there for a long time. We know what we get out of Andy Dalton. He's a guy who can win you, with good talent around him, he can win you 7 games, maybe get you to the playoffs, but lose in the first round. It's time to move on there, and they have a new coach there, Zach Taylor, so he might want a new quarterback. And then lastly, the Oakland Raiders. I mean, they're sitting at 4 overall right now. They have Derek Carr. We've talked about Carr on another podcast, Piano Man. I don't think Carr is the long-term solution there in Oakland, and I think this is going to be his last year in Oakland. I'd be surprised if he goes to the team, goes to Vegas with the team in 2020. So the Raiders are one of those kind of sneaky teams, Raiders and Bengals, who could, maybe they don't have a pressing quarterback need now, but would we be surprised if they took one? No, not at all. Another team, lastly, that you can make the argument for is the Miami Dolphins, who don't have a quarterback. They have Ryan Fitzpatrick, but I still think, like I just said, the Dolphins at 13 overall are actually literally going to tank this year and take their chances on either Tua for Alabama or maybe even 2 years when Trevor Lawrence comes out of Clemson. I'm sure he's going to be the number 1 overall pick. So we've evaluated the teams. The Giants at 6 and 17, the Broncos at 10, the Redskins at 15, maybe the Raiders at 4, maybe the Bengals at 11. And the Raiders at 4 is extra interesting because remember, Piano Man, they have picked 24 and 27 overall. They have 2 other first-round picks thanks to Amari Cooper and Khalil Mack being shipped out, and they could use those picks to move up for a quarterback who maybe falls. And the guy that I could see falling, maybe not all the way to the Raiders pick at 24, but into the teens, I would say, that everyone else seems to have him going top 10 for sure, but Dwayne Haskins out of Ohio State is the guy that I kind of see slipping. I just can't really find a marriage for him right now because I'm looking at these other quarterbacks. I know, I don't want to say for a fact, but because nothing's factual in the draft, but based on everything I've read and heard and everything that the Giants stand for and all my research, I'm very confident that the Giants like Drew Lock a lot, and I'm very confident the Giants like Daniel Jones a lot. Daniel Jones, I personally wouldn't vouch for the pick, but he's a guy who could be their pick at 17 if he's there. So the Giants, Drew Lock and Daniel Jones. I know I don't want to say fact, but I have it on good authority that the Denver Broncos love Drew Lock, and they're sitting there at 10. So we have a couple Lock suitors. I know the Raiders have visited a lot with Lock, so I think Lock is going to be a top 10 pick overall. I think at the very latest he ends up to the Bengals at 11. I just don't see him getting past the Broncos at 10. So Lock will probably be a top 10 pick. Haskins, I don't know. I just can't find a marriage for him. I know the Redskins like Daniel Jones. I know the Giants like Daniel Jones in that 15 to 17 range. So it's tough. I just don't see the Giants taking quarterback at 6. And if they do, I think it's going to be Locke and not Haskins. And obviously Kyler Murray's I believe he's going to go number 1 overall. So really, if there's anybody who falls, we're looking to the teens, maybe an Aaron Rodgers-like slip here. He went to the 20s, but it's probably going to be Dwayne Haskins. And the other variable here, Piano Man, is, which I'm sure you might have just thought of, when you're thinking here at the Redskins at 15, a lot of people are going to look at the draft order and be like, okay, well, you're saying he's going to fall, to the teens, but he's never going to get past the Redskins at 15. But keep in mind, Josh Rosen for the Cardinals is also a guy who is likely going to be dealt, especially if the Cardinals do what everybody thinks and drafts Kyler Murray. Josh Rosen is likely going to be dealt for a second-round pick or a late first here. And the Redskins are a team that could, maybe take in Josh Rosen for their second-round pick and maybe send back Case Keenum to the Cardinals. Case Keenum could kind of be a stopgap quarterback there like he is for a lot of guys who can kind of start in year 1, let Kyler Murray get the hang of things. And Case Keenum's also played in Kingsbury's system before. So there's a lot of reasons why maybe a trade with Washington, Josh Rosen to Washington makes sense. So if that happens, that takes Washington off the board for quarterbacks. And then if the Bengals don't take him at 11 and the Redskins have Josh Rosen, we're really looking at a potential slip to Dwayne Haskins. And if that happens, I think the Raiders are going to use their ammunition and kind of move up to the late teens and try to end Haskins' slide. I think Kyler Murray, number 1 overall. I think Drew Lock, Denver at 10, Giants at 6 at the earliest. I think Dwayne Haskins probably around the teens, maybe the Redskins, maybe the Raiders if they move up. And Haskins also maybe the Bengals at 11. And then Daniel Jones, that 15 to 17 range, Washington and New York Giants there if they don't take Rosen or another quarterback earlier.
So every draft is different. You may have a top-heavy quarterback draft. You may have like an outstanding running back class or, maybe a skill position. What are the positions that are really standing out this year?
Piano Man, it's a meat and potatoes draft. And what that means is that it's all big men, big trench players. In my mock right now, this is a pretty accurate assessment of what I think is going on right now. 17 of the top 32 picks in my mock are either offensive linemen or defensive linemen. So pass rushers, defensive tackles, offensive guards, all the big trench players. Half the draft in the first round, I would wager, is going to be either an offensive lineman or a defensive lineman. Is it boring? Yeah, I would say. But let me tell you what, Piano Man, a lot of teams are happy about that. I know the fans might not be happy about it because they like, flashy receivers and running backs and quarterbacks. But, there is a shortage right now of good quality offensive linemen in the NFL. Okay. Yeah, I would say even more so than quarterbacks now. And offensive tackles are so expensive. So when you can get one on a rookie deal, that's huge for cap purposes. So a lot of teams are pumped up about this being a meat and potatoes draft and having so many great offensive tackles. The best positions for the draft are offensive tackle, defensive tackle, and tight end. This is one of the deepest classes for tight end in years. I mean, and since I can remember, honestly, this class is loaded at tight end. I think if we're just going through the other positions, linebackers, extremely top heavy. You use the word top heavy. That's a perfect way to describe linebackers. There's Devin White and Devin Bush out of Michigan. And after the two Devins, there's a massive drop off. So teams that have a need at linebacker, that's why you see Devin White and Devin Bush going higher than they normally would, because there's no third guy there until maybe even the third round, late second. So huge drop off after the two Devins at linebacker, and that will drive up Devin White and Devin Bush's stock. Terrible running back class. That's another thing. I know we like running backs. I know we play fantasy football. I know a lot of people who watch the draft, especially since the Saints don't have a pick, are going to be, trying to be scouting for who they want to take in fantasy football. Unfortunately, that's not going to come on day one of the draft. I think maybe one running back gets taken in the first round, maybe one, Josh Jacobs out of Alabama. And even then, that would be really late, maybe to like a team like the Raiders at 27, for example. And that's, even then, I think that's a 50-50 proposition. I don't know if a running back is going to be taken in the first round. If it's not going to be Josh Jacobs to the Raiders, I haven't heard anything else about any team being interested in one of those running backs. Receivers, this class has no bona fide superstars at receiver, so that kind of hurts for fantasy football too. But the good news about receivers is the class is deep. There are, I would say, no receivers are going to be taken in the top 15. But I do think 12 receivers, about 12 to 13 receivers will go in that 16 to 60 range. That after the top 15 picks, that first and latter half of the first and second round, I think will be littered with receivers because it's a deep receiver class, but it's not top heavy. And then lastly, defensive back. No shutdown corners in this draft. So it's Greedy Williams versus Byron Murphy out of Washington to be the CB1 in this draft. I don't think either of them actually goes to the 20s, honestly. And we also may only see like one safety in round one, maybe 2 or 3 corners in round one, which is crazy given the passing state of the NFL right now. So it's a weak class for defensive back, weak class for running back. And I know, not a top-heavy class for receivers. And I know that's kind of boring for fans. But again, tight end, defensive tackle, offensive tackle, so many good ones in this class. So that'll be a lot more fun for NFL GMs than it will be for fans watching.
I know that you talked just now about Greedy Williams and Devin White. We're obviously LSU fans. We do a local podcast for the Saints and Pelicans, but we are LSU faithful. So we have 2 top prospects of Devin White, Greedy Williams. We know them both. I did post on Twitter a few days ago. Devin White was on First Take, and they were asking him, those kind of like boring questions. What would you do in this situation? How do you feel about this? And he was very surprising in his answers. He knows he's the quarterback of the defense. I think he's a top 5 prospect, but he could end up being the best player in this draft. And I think Greedy Williams, he was a top 10 pick at one point in the mock drafts. And he's really slipped down to the 20s in most drafts. So what are your thoughts individually about each player, and do you think they're fairly evaluated right now?
Well, first of all, Devin White's a phenomenal player. There's no doubt about that. He's a classic. I won't even say classic. He's a new age sideline to sideline linebacker. He's extremely athletic, probably a 90th percentile athlete for the linebacker position, I would say. He's everything. He can cover. He can blitz. He does everything. He seems like a great leader. He's exactly what a lot of teams will want in the linebacker position. But I will say this, though. As great as being a 3-down player is, teams don't really value inside linebackers extremely high. And, last year, look, for example, you can argue that Roquan Smith was an even better prospect, or at least a similar prospect to Devin White. I think a lot of talent evaluators would actually say that Roquan Smith was a slightly better prospect, even if you say they're even. Roquan Smith didn't go until 8 overall, and he only went because Vic Fangio is obsessed with linebackers, and he had to take him at 8. And the thing is that linebackers just, even the elite ones, like Lee Kuechly went 9 overall. Pat Willis, I remember, went 11 or 12 overall. Even the elite linebacker prospects coming out don't go as high as you think. Now, that said, I just mentioned Devin White and Devin Bush are the only good linebackers in this class, and there's a massive drop-off. So you're going to see some teams who are linebacker needy might actually kind of buck the trend there, and one of those teams is Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay sitting at 5 overall. Heavy reported interest in Devin White, and they've made it no secret. I don't think it's a smokescreen. There's certain connections there, and I believe that Tampa Bay is very interested in Devin White. I don't believe, though, that it's at 5 overall for the reasons that I've said. I think that Tampa Bay is going to try to trade down to take Devin White maybe a couple spots. You saw them trade down a couple spots last year to take Vita Vea. Defensive tackle is another position that traditionally doesn't go that high in the draft. So I do think ultimately I'm buying Tampa Bay's interest. I don't know if it's at 5. I think if Quentin Williams is on the board, they're going to take Williams over White. But I do think Tampa Bay is in love with White. That's the team to watch. That's the team I would put my money on taking White. But it shouldn't surprise you if they trade down a few spots and then take White. Cincinnati at 11 has a huge need for a guy like Devin White or Devin Bush. And Green Bay at 12. Devin White is not getting past them, folks. So I would say, and they're sitting at 11 and 12. So Devin White's probably a sure top 12 pick unless something crazy happens on draft day. But Tampa is who I'd put my money on. Greedy Williams, hey, you mentioned it perfectly, Piano Man. This guy was projected to be a top 10 pick by almost, and even like a top 5 pick overall by a lot of experts throughout the season. But, he's 6'2", he ran a 4.37, so you would think on paper at least that, he has the makings to be a top 20 pick. But, we were watching LSU. He had a worse sophomore campaign than a freshman year when he was dominant. And I think that I just can't seem to slot him anywhere in my top 15. I just don't think there's a team that really needs cornerback that desperately. And I also, I'm going to stick with the 20 to 25 range for Greedy Williams. He might be the first corner off the draft, maybe the first defensive back off the board. But I still think it's going to be in that 20 to 25 range. The Peanut Man, look at who's picking there. The Steelers at 20. The Seattle Seahawks at 21. I mean, two teams you could really see Greedy Williams like playing style fitting for them, right? And then Houston at 23 desperately needs defensive back. Oakland at 24 needs everything on defense. And then the Eagles had so many injuries at defensive back last year, particularly cornerback, and at 25. So that 20 to 25 range right there, that's the sweet spot for Greedy Williams. They have so many teams that, may not be in love with him, but are in need of a corner. And the last thing we have to do today, we're sticking local here because we have the best question of the week, and it is a local question, and it's from Robert Smith out of New Orleans. And Robert asks, who is someone the Saints could trade back into round 1 for? Piano Man, you want to take this real quick? You got anyone in mind that you're kind of hoping, or you could see the Saints, making that huge jump back into round 1 to get?
Yeah, I don't know if he's worth getting into the first round and getting. It would secure him, but I think we can get him in the second round possibly, and that would be Will Grier. I know that, let's be honest, that Drew Brees is on either year 1 or year 2 left, in terms of being championship ready. So we have to be prepared, and, do we have that second guy with Teddy Bridgewater? Possibly, but then he's 2 years older. So do we rely on that and go with another position in the second round, or do we move up into the first round and secure a guy who we would like to groom into that position to take over? So that would be my first guess. I know that we have Jared Cook as well. He is 31 years old, and I know he's an immediate impact right now. But if we're looking for somebody for the future, like we had with Jimmy Graham early on in the 2010s, I'd look to move up into the first round and select one of those top tier tight ends as well. We might be able to be lucky and get them in the second round, but you never know. But I would go with Will Grier. What about you, Nick?
I love the Will Grier answer. I do think it's more likely that we do wait on tight ends if we're going. I agree with your answer that the Saints may not be done at tight end, right? Like Jared Cook, nice veteran to have, not the long-term solution at the position, and we are pretty vacant outside of Cook. Irv Smith is a guy in round 2 that the Saints seem to have their eye on, and a guy who I personally want for the Saints. And I do think he's going to go around mid-round 2. Maybe the Saints could move up to make a play for him. But again, it's a much bigger difference of moving up into the mid-round 2 into actually moving back into round 1 when you're picking that late in round 2. I mean, we picked 62 overall, I think, is our first pick. So we have to trade probably next year's 1 and a lot more, actually, to move back into round 1, depending on where we move. Will Grier is an interesting guy, though, because I think that he's the type of quarterback that Sean Payton I could see really falling in love with, to be honest. And if Will Grier slips into round 2, I could see the Saints maybe making a play for him. But keep in mind, we could pull a Baltimore Ravens last year. Teams like to move up to that pick 32. If Will Grier's on the board at pick 32, which I expect he will be. Why do they like to move up to round 1? Because you get that 5th-year option on a contract. Every other contract after round 1 is 4 years automatically. So you get a 5th-year option, team option for round 1 picks. So that's huge for a quarterback, right? So especially when the first 2 years of Will Grier's career could be, sitting behind Drew Brees. So that 5th-year option would be huge. So it wouldn't be totally crazy to move in for Will Grier. And if we're looking for an impact player now, though, my bold prediction, actually, I don't want to say it's a bold prediction, but, I want to say that I wouldn't be totally stunned if the Saints move up, if Ed Oliver, the defensive tackle, and I know he's supposed to be a top 10 pick overall, but I have a feeling that the Saints are in love with this guy. I really do, for a number of reasons. First of all, I think Ed Oliver is a top 5 talent in this class, but he's going a little later than top 5 just because of a variety of different issues that the Saints aren't going to care about. I think that this guy is a top 5 talent in this class. I think the Saints have him probably as a top 5 talent on their board, if I had to guess. And it's a huge position of need. Sean Payton identified the primary positions of need at the NFL Combine. Defensive tackle was his first one. Ed Oliver is such a freak, athlete. He reminds me of Aaron Donald, who's the best defensive player in the game. He's a little lighter, of course, and not as strong. But, he's that quick. And think about the Saints' needs right now. Sheldon Rankins, who knows if he comes back with his torn Achilles. When he comes back from his torn Achilles. Imagine the Saints' defensive line with Cam Jordan, Ed Oliver, Sheldon Rankins when he comes back, and then Marcus Davenport when he comes into his own. That is a line set up for the future, and I think the Saints are kind of probably salivating about that. But again, it's about price, man. You have to pay a heavy, heavy price. You're mortgaging the future if you trade back into the first round like that. But if we do it for any guy, I think it's going to be Ed Oliver. And I think that would be the perfect, finishing touch to stacking this Saints roster and going all out to winning the Super Bowl in 2019, 2020. All right, guys, and that'll wrap up this week's NFL Draft Podcast. We're going to be doing 2 or 3 more podcasts that are devoted to the NFL draft, especially as the draft gets closer. We're going to be breaking down specific players. We're going to go 1 through 32, and I'm going to be telling you pretty much everything I know about every pick in this draft. So maybe you even can enter mock draft contest and do mocks of your own with the information I provide, and you can beat me. So, surely, why not? So April is NFL Draft Month, and we'll be all over that. So make sure you tune in. If you like what you heard today, make sure you become one of our best friends by subscribing to this podcast and giving us a great rating on iTunes. Thank you for Piano Man for filling in as host today. He's normally our great producer and editor. We'll be back next week talking NFL Draft with Piano Man again. Tell all your friends, who dat.